Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Housing is the Cure, a national briefing on COVID-19 and the eviction crisis. My name is Allison Johnson. I am the Executive Director with Housing Justice League. We are a grassroots, community-led, affordable housing advocacy organization here in the city of Atlanta. We are so excited to be here with you and the incredible lineup of speakers and presenters who you'll be hearing from throughout the event. Today, we will be hosting this meeting with interpretation in Spanish and closed captioning. To access the Spanish language audio line, please dial the number on your screen and punch in the meeting ID when prompted, followed by the pound sign. Phone number 646-558-8656. The meeting ID 98900009035. Closed captioning will automatically appear on your Zoom screen. If you are watching on your Facebook, go to the link being dropped in the chat to view closed captioning. For those of you participating via Facebook or YouTube Live, we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the comment features. For those of you participating via Zoom, we invite you to introduce your name and location in the chat and to use the chat box to submit your thoughts and questions. We want to thank all of our co-sponsors and our esteemed guests and all of you who are joining us today. So let me just take a minute and talk to you about why we are here today. And I really want to ground it in the city of Atlanta, the city where I'm born and raised. I live, work, worship, and pray. Atlanta, the home of the Black Mecca, so they say. But Atlanta is really the city that is in the top 5 with the fastest rate of gentrification. Atlanta is the #1 city of income inequality. Atlanta's slogan is a city too busy to hate, meaning we don't have time to listen or include poor and working class communities. A city that gives millions and billions of big tax breaks to already wealthy corporations, while most Black and Brown communities struggle to find safe, decent, affordable housing. As this nation's democracy is exposed, so is racial inequalities that are rooted in housing. While all eyes are on Georgia, hoping that the vote will be our saving grace, I'm here to tell you that while it would be extremely helpful, it's not the end of the rainbow. As protests engulf the city of Atlanta, many factors of ingrained social justice and racial inequality stem from the country's housing system, for which decades have been discriminated against renters and homeowners of color. Housing security is a matter of justice, as structural racism continues to put more communities of color unfairly at risk of being rent burdened or homeless. The pandemic's economic impacts, just like its health impacts, haven't been borne equally by all Americans. On the ground here in Atlanta, Black and brown workers have seen greater loss of employment than white workers, and Black and brown families are more likely than white families will face the prospect of evictions and losing their homes. More than 20% of Atlantans are housing insecure, but COVID makes it worse. When 40-hour work weeks are just not guaranteed, and there aren't strong federal, state, and local policies to protect our most vulnerable population. But here's what we must do. We must be proactive. We must be proactive to eliminate hypervacancies, naked policies. Racial inequalities that are rooted in housing discrimination must be eradicated. We must demand and reform fair housing. We know that racism is forced through capitalism, and we must build a united people's power. And as my grandmother used to say, and we must take our hands out of Mr. Charlie's pocket, because as long as our hands are in Mr. Charlie's pocket, we have to do what Mr. Charlie say do. We no longer are just demanding a seat at the table. We demand the entire banqueting hall. Not down the road, not later, but right now. It is our time, and it's been our time. We won't relive this history, but we will rewrite it. And we will rewrite it with our own authors and our own illustrations. So with that, I'll bring you to get ready to introduce some of the people we'll be listening to and hearing from today. We'll hear from some of our frontline health workers, tenant leaders, legal scholars, public health experts, movement leaders about the intersection between the ongoing public health and economic crisis brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic and the impending eviction crisis that millions of families are facing across the country. We will unveil and outline a comprehensive solutions platform of executive and congressional actions necessary to prevent evictions and ensure that families are safe, are healthy, and secure now and into the future. And with that, I'd like to welcome 4 powerful guests who will be joining us for our opening panel. Evictions are a public health crisis. First off, we want to welcome Kathy Kennedy of National Nurses United. Kathy is the Vice President of NNU and President of the California Nurses Association, and has been a registered nurse for over 40 years. She currently is staff at Kaiser Permanente, Rossville's Women and Children's Center. We are also joined by Bishop Harper. Bishop is a tenant leader with Organized Florida's Orlando chapter, and a leader of the Florida Housing Justice Alliance. Bishop is a father and a leader. And then next, we'd like to welcome Niklaus Salvatore, a tenant leader and member of the Struggle for Miami's Affordable and Sustainable Housing, and the chair of the SMASH LGBTQ Shelter Committee, where he advocates on Miami's homelessness issues. Niklaus knows firsthand how cultural differences and family clashes can lead to homelessness for LGBTQ youth. And that's why he's dedicated himself to the SMASH Housing Project and its development. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Emily Bennifer. Professor Bennifer is a visiting professor of law and the founding director of the Health Justice Clinic at Wake Forest School of Law. Her clinic practice and research focus on the intersection of social determinants of health, racial inequality, and poverty, with an emphasis on housing. Currently, Professor Benifer is the chair of the American Bar Association's COVID-19 Task Force Committee on Eviction and co-creator of the COVID-19 Housing Policy Scorecard with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. She's the principal investigator in a study of nationwide COVID-19 moratoriums and housing policies. So, Kathy, welcome. We're going to start here with you today.
Great.
So, Kathy, can you describe a current moment we're in with the COVID pandemic and its particular impacts on Black, Indigenous, people of color, and working class communities?
Absolutely, Allison. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak about the catastrophic impact COVID-19 is having on my patients, nurses, and all frontline healthcare workers. To be blunt, the situation is extremely dire. On my darkest day, I feel as though I live in a compassionless world that has left the most vulnerable and those of us fighting to keep them healthy, safe, and alive to fend for ourselves. Let me ground this statement in some really grave statistics about COVID-19. As of last Friday, the global total for infections was well over 72.5 million. The global death total stood at over 1.6 million. And currently, here in the United States, is leading the world in infections and deaths with over 16 million infection, meaning about 22% of global COVID-19 deaths are here in the United States, and we have had over 300,000 deaths. Over the last week, cases have surged by 1.4 million, the highest weekly number yet recorded, and this current surge is bringing new peaks in daily and weekly infections and deaths. So, of course, vulnerable groups like Black, Indigenous, and people of color and working class communities are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, bearing the brunt of this cruelty. In this country, people of color get sicker and die more often than whites. And this is true also for COVID-19. Throughout this pandemic, BIPOC communities have gotten sicker and died from COVID-19 at higher rates than whites. Native Americans, Blacks, Latinx people are hospitalized from COVID-19 at about 4 times the rate and are dying from this virus at over twice the rate of whites. Latinx adults between the ages of 40 and 59 have been infected at 5 times the rate of white people of the same age. Moreover, people of color are getting infected and dying from COVID-19 at rates higher than their share of the total population. As a registered nurse, I frequently have people of color who are low income or undocumented, and they're not just numbers and statistics to me. These are human lives. People who are suffering tremendously because our country is failing them, failing to provide proper health care, adequate housing, and social and economic protections. My fellow nurses and other frontline healthcare workers are also suffering and dying. And as of again last Friday, 272 registered nurses have died due to COVID. Additionally, 2,117 healthcare workers who are not registered nurses have died from COVID-19. So that's a total of 2,389 healthcare workers who have died. Infection rates among healthcare workers are also abysmal. In the United States, over 515,000 healthcare workers have been infected with COVID-19. And let me note that there is no central reporting for this information. Our federal officials are not collecting the data. Our lives are expendable to them. They don't even want to count how many of us are getting sick and dying. So instead, my union has been diligently collecting this data to the best of our ability. And as I watch my colleagues get infected on the job, we continue to fight tooth and nail for our employers to provide us with just adequate personal protective equipment, PPE, and staffing. So I'm sure you probably heard hospital executives claim that they're doing their best. But the truth is, hospitals are making enormous profits this year. And this is possible because they are using this pandemic as an excuse to undermine patient care, to cut corners, and fail to provide proper staffing and equipment for us to do our jobs. So throughout this pandemic, we've been called heroes. Heroes. We don't want to be heroes. All we want to do is be nurses who do our jobs, take care of our patients without the threat of preventable infection and disease.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much for your service. We really do appreciate it. Next question, Kathy. How do you see housing stability impacting your patients' or members' health in general or in the context of COVID?
What we see is that health and housing is intimately related. Affordable housing is a fundamental human right and the functional pillar of health. The unavailability of affordable housing affects health in two critical ways. First, when a high percentage of income is devoted to rent, that often means that something else is, you're cutting back other necessities such as food and medical expenses. And second, when safe, affordable housing is unavailable, tenants may accept substandard and unhealthy housing. And currently, the number of individuals applying for unemployment insurance is rising, and many are facing eviction. The health effects of evictions are acute and include a heightened risk for several physical and psychosocial ailments, increased rates of drug use, a greater chance of experiencing sexual assault. Those who have been evicted are more likely to die from any cause, have increased rates of HIV and AIDS complications, and are more likely to suffer from depression. Currently, people of color are less able to pay rent, and this is deadly during this pandemic, and we know the primary way to help curb rising infections is to stay home and social distance. But to effectively quarantine and self-isolate, people need access to safe, affordable, secure housing. And housing has to include access to clean water and power. And by not ensuring safe, affordable housing, we're putting all of our communities at risk for this infection. Widespread evictions, foreclosures, and utility cutoffs would cause immense economic and social damage, fuel the pandemic, and exacerbate the inequalities that we're already seeing. Vulnerable populations, including BIPOC communities, women and children, would feel immediate and long-term ramifications disproportionately. And we must act immediately to limit the damages already inflicted. We need solutions like rent cancellation and an extension of the federal eviction moratorium. Our country is failing my patients, it's failing me, my colleagues, all of us. If COVID-19 has shown us anything, it is the huge social fractures that characterize our society. It has exposed inequalities in how we view and access healthcare, housing, education, and science. To curb this pandemic, housing must be a part of this solution. It must be a sustainable solution that addresses the root causes of eviction and improves the health and livelihood for everyone in this country. So knowing that we are united in this fight for a sustainable end to this pandemic makes me feel hopeful that we're going to find our way out. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kathy.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And for so many other millions of frontline health workers for your day in and day out struggle, for the health and safetyness of all families. We certainly
very
appreciate you. Next, I want to turn to Bishop Harper down in Orlando. Bishop, welcome.
Greetings and salutations. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you. So we just heard from Kathy about the ways that the pandemic is impacting our communities across the country. And we want to turn our focus to the ways that the eviction and housing crisis are worsening these impacts. So, what has been the impact of the crisis on your family and community in Orlando?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bishop Donald Harper from Orlando, Florida. I oversee the Father's House Open Door Ministry. I am a culinary supervisor. I'm currently on furlough with my company since March 21st of this year. And as of April, I have received no pay, no nothing. So as of April, I have been on 84 interviews, and every interview I have been on, they have said that I was overqualified. So in the midst of it being overqualified, what does that mean? I just want to work. I just want to provide for my family, because also I'm a newlywed. And so in the midst of that, COVID-19 has destroyed wedding plans, has destroyed housing for us, because we're in the process of being evicted. So I have applied for several positions, and I just had an interview this morning, matter of fact, and the guy told me that I was overqualified, had too many degrees, and he would love to have me on board, but he couldn't afford me. I'm a father of 9 children as well, but my main priority is to take care of my wife and my children and find a secure place for us to go and live. Also, I have applied for the shelters here in Orlando, and they're all full. Every last one of them full. It can't take a whole family of my size. Then I was also told that we have to split the family up, and only some of the kids can go with us. And so what do we do? This is unacceptable. We didn't ask for COVID-19 to come into our lives, but it's here. We have to deal with it. We have to understand that my family and I are looking like, what do we do? How do we do this? We're running out of, we didn't run out of money yet, but we running out of money that my wife and I saved up. So what do we do in that instance? Uh, how do we save ourselves? Because in order to get a loan to buy a house, you need what? You need the income. You need income. So I, I'm just, we need help. We need help. We need help. And that's the impact that it has caused
Yeah.
on me and my family.
Yeah. Yeah. Like many
Yeah,
other families
yeah.
that are suffering.
And
Yeah.
people are
It's
not
real.
opening their mouths.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's real. It's
It's
a real
this
problem.
is, yes, ma'am.
So, yeah. So, Bishop, what do you want to say, like, to public health officials and the elected officials about what must be done? What do you want to tell them? What do you want to say?
Get off your assets. Help us, because this is not a game. You all are in your houses. You're not getting kicked out of your house. Not getting placed out of your house. You have your house. You have your stability. Where's our stability? Where's our justice? They talk. They do. My daughter says. My daughter says this. You do this. I see your mouth doing this, but we need you to do this and do this. Here you go. We need your help. We need assistance right now. We need relief right now. The people need release. We are being punished because COVID-19 is like a bad girlfriend that we didn't want to sign up for, or a bad boyfriend that you didn't want to sign up for. You know, and COVID-19 is not our Boaz. Okay, so the thing is that they need to get off their assets, stop doing all this talking. We need help. We needed help yesterday. You know, we needed help yesterday. So in the midst of help, why are you guys still talking about this? You,
Hmm.
if one of the elected officials of the government was in the same boat as we were, then they would get off their assets and then they would help us faster than fast. If their mother and their father was in the same boat as we were, they would help us, but they're not. They're not.
Thank, yeah. Thank you,
You're
Bishop. Thank
welcome.
you so much
You're welcome.
for
I,
bringing all of
I,
that realness to this.
I'm sorry for being so colorful.
That's absolutely okay. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
next, I'm going to turn to Nicholas. I'm going to turn to you. We just heard from Bishop, who is up in Orlando, about the ways he and his family are fighting, to keep their home, to stay in their homes. You had to contend with an eviction earlier this year, and you are now organizing with the LGBT youth in Miami to stop evictions. So, what is the impact of the pandemic, Nicholas? Um, the What's the impact of the pandemic and evictions looked like for you and your community? Maybe a little audio trouble, Nicholas. Having a harder time hearing you. It's a little slow. We are having just a little technical difficulties with Nicholas. So we'll come back once we get that together. We'll come back to you, Nicholas. Okay, we're going to come back to Nicholas, everyone. And I'm going to turn to you, Professor Benifer. Thank you so much for joining us. So you've been tracking and you've been studying moratoriums throughout the pandemic. What have been the consequences of lifting the moratoria?
So looking at the moratoria across the country since March, we've seen a few things happen, especially when you lift the moratorium. So when you lift them, the first thing that happens is a significant jump in eviction filings. And the eviction lab at Princeton University is tracking this. So you can take a look at their website and see what's happening in 27 cities across the country. But second, once those evictions start to occur, we see first a spread in COVID-19 cases and deaths, and we see an increase in health inequity among people of color, as well as long-term harm among the same population. And we also see that the requirement for robust interventions. So first, the spikes in filings. So according to the Eviction Lab, in the 2 weeks between when the CARES Act, the federal moratorium on federally assisted housing and federally backed mortgages, so when that expired, there was a 2-week gap before the CDC moratorium on evictions went into effect. During that time period, the gap in federal protections, eviction filings rose as high as 395% of historic averages. So when the CDC moratorium expires on New Year's Eve this year, we can expect to see a similar extreme spike in filings as soon as courts open again after the holiday and begin processing that. So the eviction machine will rev up very quickly. And then second, the spread of COVID-19. So we compared the eviction moratoriums that lifted over the summer to those that stayed in place. And in that 3-month period, we found a 2.1 higher COVID-19 incidence and a 5.4 times increase in mortality in the states that lifted their moratoriums to those that didn't. This amounted to 433,700 excess cases of COVID-19 and 10,700 excess deaths due to lifting moratoriums alone. So the eviction itself, due to the doubling up with others and the transiency and couch surfing and moving from couch to couch and residing in crowded environments like homeless shelters, all of those increase transmission of COVID-19. They make it impossible to shelter in place, impossible to social distance, and that's what increases transmission of the disease and affects populations who are also more likely to suffer from comorbidities that if they contracted COVID-19 would result in hospitalization, if not death. And so in the states that did not lift their moratoriums, they prevented approximately 50,000 deaths from COVID-19. So just to demonstrate how important these moratoriums are as a pandemic mitigation strategy, so a public health tool. And one of the reasons why eviction furthers health inequity during the pandemic is because the vulnerability of the population who's affected by eviction also has that higher rate of complications if they contract COVID-19. So this is why, and you heard earlier, that Black households and historically marginalized groups are experiencing COVID-19 hospitalization and death at much higher rates than their white counterparts. And one statistic is particularly stark, that people of color are dying at rates of white people who are a decade or more older than them from COVID-19. And then on top of that, for those who survive the pandemic, who don't contract COVID-19 or experience death because of it, eviction creates barrier after barrier to safe and decent housing. It affects employment. It affects your ability to access good schools and safe neighborhoods. And it results in this downward spiral that just is a cycle that continues, this housing disparity and economic disparity. And in the long term, can have severe physical and mental health effects. And for children, it's particularly traumatizing, resulting in emotional trauma. It can cause brain damage due to lead poisoning, academic decline, food insecurity. It even takes years off of their life, decreasing their life expectancy. So all of this is to say that allowing the eviction crisis to continue will have devastating outcomes, especially for people of color and historically marginalized communities, but also for future generations who will be recovering from this for decades to come.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Wow. It's like thousands of deaths and hundreds and thousands of cases could be prevented by taking more swift action to prevent evictions and guaranteeing that all people have a safe and quality and stable home. So why did that happen? What was wrong with what was in place in the first place?
Well, it largely depended on where you lived, what kind of protection you received. At the peak of protections around May, 43 states and the District of Columbia had a moratorium in place on eviction. However, those moratoriums were not equal. They applied to different categories of renters. In some places, you had to prove that you had experienced COVID-19 job or wage loss or medical expenses. And in other places, it didn't freeze all stages of eviction. So in some places, the moratorium only stopped the sheriff from executing that eviction. So the moment that moratorium lifted, all of those evictions went forward. And in other places, they froze the initiation. So you never received a notice or a filing. And it's that filing that triggers that downward spiral in the first place. So they weren't equal. And then the federal moratorium, which was thought initially to be this really important public health measure to protect against eviction and the COVID-19 and the long-term health harms that it creates, it lacked uniform implementation. It lacked any form of enforcement, and it didn't have any education on tenant rights or property owner obligations. And because of this, it was inconsistently implemented across the country. So from magistrate to magistrate or judge to judge, your outcomes varied depending on where you lived.
Yeah. So what are the possibilities now? And what are some things that the government can do now to protect and stabilize families right now?
We are at an incredibly dangerous point in the pandemic. If the CDC moratorium lifts, up to 40 million adults and children could face eviction, and the possible contraction of COVID-19 and that downward spiraling of health harms that will make it impossible to control the pandemic and will undermine any attempts at a vaccine across the country as people are transient and lack access to consistent healthcare due to eviction. So first and foremost, the federal government must extend the federal moratorium beyond December 31st, at least until the pandemic is under control, and they have to improve it. The federal moratorium should apply to all renters. It should apply consistently across states, and it has to apply at the very beginning of the eviction process, so at the very notice to tenants across the board. And at the same time, this is only a public health mitigation strategy. It is not going to address the eviction crisis. And the only way to do that is to cover the back rent owed, which is estimated upwards of $25 billion in this point in time, not over the whole course of the pandemic. And at the same time, address the rent burden and make up that difference for renters so that they're able to stay safely housed throughout the rest of the pandemic and to aid in the recovery process from the pandemic itself as well. So that's estimated at upwards of $100 billion for emergency rental assistance and to address the needs of people who are already experiencing homelessness.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. We really appreciate it. I want to go back and just to see if we have Niklas on the, are you? Niklas, are you able to speak now? Okay, if we have time, we'll be sure to come back. Some very important information that I think folks will really want to hear. So right now, we're going to try to transition as quickly as possible. We are running a couple of minutes of behind, but just to sum it up from our speakers, we heard how very important it is to make sure that we're all speaking this language, talking about the significance, of evictions and the spread, and just to be making sure that everyone understand what's really going on, what we're not hearing in the media every day, what's happening with our frontline workers, what's happening to tenants who don't get tenant trainings, what's happening to people who are unemployed. all of this is so impactful to what's happening. And it didn't just start with COVID. We understand that. But it has really exposed what's happening in our nation. Um, and so I'm going to take some time right now to introduce our next person up. And we have a real special treat planned for everyone today. And I want to introduce Liliana Herrera. And Liliana is out of San Francisco. She's a songwriter from Calexico, California. I'm sorry. She was born into the musical family and has worked for many years as a professional musician and has always contributed many years of language justice movement work as an interpreter. You can check her out, more of her music on her website, liltunes.com. And so I'll turn it over to you, Liliana. Welcome.
Thank you, Allison. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I think that it's time to listen to the music of our hearts. Don't you agree? Housing is a human right. Let's stick together and not give up the fight. Housing is a human right. Let's stick together. Let's stick together, not give up this fight. No, venimos de distintos lugares. Oh, algunas diferencias, pero sueños similares. Venimos de distintos lugares. Oh, algunas diferencias, pero sueños similares. I'm here to share a little story, free like a bird flying in all her glory. Unity is what we need, 'cause we need each other. We need each other like sisters and brothers, yeah. U-N-I-O-N, union, U-N-I-O-N, U-N-I-O-N, U-N-I-O-N. Solo en unión se oyen bien todas las voces. Acentos de colores como arcoíris responden. Whether you say union or union with an accent, different colors make a rainbow, not racist reaction. Hey, U-N-I-O-N, together exploring. U-N-I-O-N. Our power is growing, U-N-I-O-N. Todos en unión, con compasión. We are union, we are one. We don't give up till we are done finding solutions. Amidst confusion, we are one. We are union, we are one. We don't give up, we don't give up, we don't give up, we don't give up. U-N-I-O-N, together exploring. U-N-I-O-N. Our power is growing, oh, when we're together, oh, 'cause housing is a human right. U-N-I-O-N, U-N-I-O-N. We can do this en unión. Muchas gracias.
Everybody give it up for Liliana Herrera. Un aplauso. Beautiful, powerful. Thank you so much, Liliana, for joining us today. Art and expression are so critical for our health too, just like housing and all of the other basic necessary resources in our lives, right? It's how we stay connected. It's how we stay grounded to what really matters, especially in hard times like this. So thank you so much again, Liliana, for sharing your song and your talent with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. So my name is Sophia Simon Ortiz. I'm with Human Impact Partners. We are a national public health organization that works to transform the field of public health to center equity and build collective power with social justice movements. It is my true honor today to welcome Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones, who will share her thoughts on what is critically needed in a public health response in this moment. Who better to look to in this immensely challenging and heartbreaking time than the guidance, the expertise, and the wisdom of Dr. Jones, who has continually pushed our field to hold true to our commitments to equity, anti-racism, and to take bold actions and even risks to create the conditions for health and thriving, especially in our communities who have been denied health justice for so long in this country, for centuries, really. Dr. Jones is a renowned epidemiologist, physician, professor, public health leader, and anti-racist activist. She is a past president of the American Public Health Association, currently a fellow at Harvard University, and adjunct professor at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University, and an adjunct associate professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine, also in Atlanta. Dr. Jones was also an assistant professor at the Harvard School of Public Health from 1994 to 2000, before being recruited to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 2000 to 2014, where she served as a medical officer and research director on social determinants of health and equity. Dr. Jones' work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on health and well-being in our nation. She seeks to broaden the national health debate to include not only universal access to high-quality healthcare, but also attention to the social determinants of health, including economic injustice and poverty, and the social determinants of equity, including racism. So Dr. Jones, thank you so very much for being on with us today. It's truly an honor, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And I'm really delighted to be part of this Housing is the Cure national briefing. There's been so much knowledge dropped already, and there'll be more knowledge dropped after I finish. So I just want to add a perspective. First of all, as a public health physician committed to equity, I want to say that we know that health is not created within the health sector. Health is not created in our hospitals and in our clinics. It's not created by a vaccine. Health is created through the conditions of our lives. And when we want to talk about health equity, we have to understand that health equity is about assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people, where one of those core conditions is housing. Especially in the context of this pandemic, housing not only provides us shelter and safety, it provides us a place for our families to be together. It provides us a place where many of us are educating our children. It provides, all of that we need. And to challenge and threaten housing at this time, as Emily Benfer already documented, when you take housing away from people, then you are putting them at much increased risk. This is certainly not the time. So I wanted to say that when we talk about health equity, there are three core principles for achieving health equity that we must lift up and apply. The first is that we must value all individuals and populations equally. We need to listen to the voices of those who have spoken before and who will come after. We need to, when you value people and you value communities, you invite their input, you listen, you invest in them, you protect them, you engage and love them in all of the ways that you value your own children. The second principle is to recognize and rectify historical injustices, which in the short term is about continuing an eviction moratorium and actually doing rent cancellation, and also requires longer term interventions on housing and the lack of equity we see in our housing sector. The third of these three principles is providing resources according to need. And clearly, at this time, one of the main needs that we have as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a nation is for people to actually shelter safely in place at home. And so to go against that and put people out in the midst of this raging pandemic, to put people in harm's way is not what we need to do. So now I want to raise the question, why would we not cancel rent? Why would we not extend the eviction moratorium? Why would we not pay people and families a survival check so that more people could safely shelter in place at home? Why would we not make workplaces safer by having standards, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA standards governing workplaces, and having more personal protective equipment available to all of our workers, not just those in the healthcare workforce, but also those in transportation, those in food production and in warehouses and the like? Why would we not decrease transmission of this virus through wearing our masks as individuals, as well as putting mask mandates in place as a government? And so just to give us a better sense of why we as a nation are not doing these things that would value all of us equally, that would recognize and rectify historical injustices, that would provide resources according to need, I just want to share with you what I describe as 7 barriers that are deeply ingrained in our national psyche that we must address now and into the future. These are what I describe also as 7 values targets for anti-racism, anti-all systems of structured inequity action. The first of these barriers is our narrow focus on the individual, which makes systems and structures either invisible or seemingly irrelevant. And that, coupled with another of these barriers, our endorsement of the myth of meritocracy, the story that goes something like this: if you work hard, you will make it. And when we don't recognize that, yes, most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who's made it has worked hard, but most people who've made it have worked hard. But there are many, many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field that has been structured by racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, and the like. When we deny those systems and instead blame those who haven't made it for being lazy or stupid, right? When we deny those systems and endorse that myth of meritocracy, then we are playing into a horrible thing that makes us maybe not want to cancel rent. I need to quick speed things up, I know, while not speaking quickly. So let me just hit on a few of these other 7 barriers to achieving health equity. A third is the fact that in this country, we are ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. The fourth is that we endorse the myth of a zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose, which makes us very selfish, and it makes us almost like as if we were at a potluck dinner table. I see you coming. I don't want you to come over here because I think you're going to eat up all of the food, because I don't even recognize that you are bringing with you all kinds of cakes and pies and roast and fruit and salad and all kinds of delicious things. I don't even value you, which makes me want to keep you out. The fifth of these 7 barriers to achieving health equity is our limited future orientation. And I give you that we can touch the future through the children and through the planet. We don't even understand that it's not about your children versus my children, that all children are our children. And we don't even think about the children in our policy making the way many American Indian nations do, when they have a 7 generations hence view of decision making. What is the impact going to be in 100 years? We don't even ask the question, how are the children? Like many East African nations do. People, Maasai people, they don't say when they greet one another, hey, how you doing? They ask, how are the children? Hoping to hear the answer, all the children are well. We don't even ask about the children. And if we did, we wouldn't get the answer, all the children are well. If we wondered about the children and recognized that all children are our children, we wouldn't even consider evicting families in the midst of a pandemic. The 6th of these 7 barriers is our endorsement of the myth of American exceptionalism, which makes us not even learn from other countries who have paid people to stay at home. They aren't worried about sending workers, essential workers, into harm's way. No, they aren't trying to think about these essential workers who are overexposed and underprotected, who are treated as if they were expendable. No, they are not doing things for the profit of the factory owners, trying to protect factory owners who knowingly put their workers in harm's way from future lawsuits. No, I am going on too long. I will say the 7th of these barriers that might help explain why we would not extend an eviction moratorium, why we would not cancel rent, because we are all in this other world, is white supremacist ideology, which I don't say as a lightning rod term to stir people up. That is simply the description of the false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation by race. There is no such hierarchy. And the falser idea that if there were such a hierarchy, which there is no such hierarchy, would put white people at the top as the ideal and the norm. This white supremacist ideology, this false idea, gives some people who are living as white a sense of entitlement. It results in the dehumanization of people of color and fear at the browning of America, which underlies a lot of our political divide today. So each of these barriers explains why it is not clear that we should, to everybody, especially among those who are our decision makers, it should be crystal clear that we need to extend the eviction moratorium until this pandemic is over and done. We should cancel rent. We should be putting, having a universal basic income, or at least what some people describe as survival checks in people's hands so that they can afford food and so that they are not pushed into unsafe workplaces. We need to make workplaces for those who really are essential in our transportation and food processing and all, make those safe workplaces by producing more PPE, personal protective equipment, invoke the Defense Production Act if necessary. All of these things that we need to put in place. So I want to close by saying that it's clear that the virus is not the only threat to us. Homelessness is a threat. And that the vaccine is not even the most important cure. Public health strategies right now to stop transmission of the virus and to protect our healthcare workers and our hospital system, public health strategies to allow people to safely shelter in place are more important. Housing is the cure, especially for those who are facing the threat of eviction and homelessness. We must be about collective caring, and we must be about collective action. And I so appreciate the invitation for me to add my thoughts to this national briefing. Thank you.
Hey Pam, you are on mute.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, y'all. I was so excited, I just jumped right in. My name's Pam. I'm with Right to the City Alliance. My pronouns are she and they. I'm really excited to share with you our executive platform. I'll start again. We're tenants and mobile home residents and folks experiencing houselessness from grassroots groups all over the country. We're from Spokane, Washington to Minneapolis, Rochester, New York to Detroit, Michigan, Medford, Oregon to Reading, Pennsylvania, Los Angeles to Philadelphia. And we've been fighting and rallying on Capitol steps, caravanning, holding space in encampments, and making it known in the streets since March of this year why staying in our homes will keep our communities healthy. The goals of today's presentation are to define these executive actions as a crucial first response to this historic public health emergency. We want to make the case that canceling rent, mortgages, and debt is a visionary solution, which we know is urgent, fits the scale of the public health crisis, and is absolutely necessary. We also want to root in and reinforce that local experiences and community vetted data must guide our public policy decisions.
Hi everyone, my name is Shakira Mingo. I'm the resource organizer with One DC, and I'm here today to tell you guys that we need strong and decisive action to help stop the pain and trauma that evictions inflict on Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. With pressure from grassroots organizations, states and local authorities have moved to respond to the needs of their residents, considering the profound burden individuals and families have been asked to bear these last 9 months since the beginning of the pandemic and economic slowdown. For example, DC did take one small baby step in the right direction when Mayor Bowser announced a $10 million in housing stabilization grants with $1 million set aside for small housing providers. While this is a step in the right direction, it's still a drop in the bucket. Then we took 12 steps back with the mayor cutting funding for homeless services as COVID-19 cases continue to surge here in the district. As you can see, we have our work cut out for us. We need federal funds so that we can scale up programs so that we can stay in our homes. We also need more people joining the fight so that we can help people stay in their homes.
Thanks, Shakira. We all know that all people should have safety, stability, and security in their housing. And we just heard amazingly from Dr. Jones and Emily Benfer that there's an unprecedented scope and scale of evictions right now, especially for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, because we're on the front lines. We're the essential workers and we're the renters, because homelessness is the real threat now. We also heard that housing protections are a critical public health strategy, and we need to provide that protective survival jacket, as Dr. Jones said, around our homes. We need to link these protections that prevented 50,000 deaths in states that did not lift their moratoriums. Dr. Jones also made a bold call to action for everyone, for all public health leaders, federal and state and local officials to act now.
Housing is the site and center of life right now. Our kids' schooling, our jobs, our meals, our healthcare, everything is happening at home right now. A moratorium on evictions can only establish security, health, and safety for every person in this country if it matches the scale of the public health emergency, closing loopholes that have left millions unprotected and uncertain where they're going to live in the middle of the pandemic, if it utilizes the full extent of the CDC's authority to help eliminate the virus spread linked to evictions that cause overcrowding and houselessness, if it addresses the power imbalance in our courts, by directing DOJ to enforce the order, and empowers and builds community among renters to learn and understand their rights so that they can pursue legal recourse when the order is violated. Specifically, the Housing is Secure Eviction Moratorium platform calls for enhancing and extending the CDC moratorium. And then we go to our slides. Other slides, okay, I'm assuming they're up. All right. So for our first slide, for our first policy action, we want to enhance and extend the existing moratorium, which expires at the end of this month. With this moratorium, we want to make it universal, so it applies to all residential renters and mobile home residents, regardless of citizenship. We want to make it retroactive. The moratorium must stop all current and future court proceedings, actions, judgments, and sweeps. We want to make it clear. We want to provide clear and enforceable guidance to local and state authorities and courts. We also want to make sure that it's transparent. We want to establish a public health hotline to renters and mandate that landlords notify the renters of their rights. And we also want to make sure this is long-term, that it ends evictions until 90 days after the COVID-19 pandemic. And it will also prohibit the accrual interest, fees, fines, and other debt related to non-payment of rent for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, Shakira. Next slide, please. We also, our second policy priority is to make sure we have a nationwide moratorium on utility shutoffs. And this includes electricity, water, broadband. We want to reinstate disconnected services so folks have vital utilities to keep clean and safe. We want to waive late payment fees and forgive all bills for low-wealth households for the duration of the emergency and extend grace periods. While some state regulators and power providers have already instituted these moratorium on electricity shutoffs, we have to extend across the country one consistent policy to ensure safety.
All right, thank you, Pam. So lastly, not eviction and utility moratorium can truly protect families and communities unless it's enforceable. For the next slide, for our policy 3, we want to prioritize the Department of Justice resources to enforce the moratorium. So we're targeting DOJ. DOJ must create mechanisms to enforce the moratorium and hold violating landlords accountable. With this, our executive action directs the Deputy Attorney General to oversee enforcement of the moratorium, including the issuing of criminal fines and penalties already authorized in the existing moratorium. The U.S. Attorney's Office in each state would coordinate between the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services to monitor compliance with the moratorium and direct Health and Human Services to partner with state and local authorities to implement the moratorium. We will issue guidance to local law enforcement ordering the prohibition on carrying out evictions, and we will also create a hotline for tenants to report any landlord violation of the moratorium order. And I'm passing it to John.
Hi, my name is John Washington with People's Action. And really what we need is a strong, universal, enforceable eviction moratorium is necessary to protect our families immediately. An eviction and utility moratorium alone is not sufficient without transformative solutions to the underlying problem. Millions of families across the country do not have stable and dignified homes. If we do not take urgent action to ensure that housing is a human right now and into the future, an eviction and utility shutoff moratorium simply kicks a wave of evictions down the road and will eventually saddle millions of people with insurmountable debt. It is unconscionable that this is allowed to happen. Every month, renters are burdened with more than $51 billion in rent, more than $462 billion since the beginning of the pandemic. Black families alone have incurred more than $82 billion in rent burden since the beginning of the pandemic. And every single month, our people are facing impossible choices. Our families forego food, water, and healthcare to pay rent and avoid eviction. Our families are forced to live in overcrowded homes and risk exposing loved ones to COVID and other viruses just to pay rent and avoid eviction. Our families are forced to take out payday loans and other debt just to keep paying the rent to avoid eviction. Our families are forced to take on additional work that puts us and our communities at even greater risk of infection, simply to pay rent and avoid eviction. To protect the health and safety of our communities, we need immediate government intervention to remove this burden on families across the country and ensure that our people are not saddled with debt. We're calling on the Biden administration and Congress to take swift action and adopt the Grassroots National Housing Justice Platform and cancel all rent, mortgage, and utility obligations from the beginning of the pandemic through the end. Now is the time for us to expand our imagination. Now is the time for us to reimagine the system of land and housing in this country. And now is the time to stop the building tsunami of evictions. We can do better. We have to do better. Let's imagine a future where our tenants are protected in their homes.
Thank you, Shakira, Pam, and John. Good afternoon, y'all. My name is Frank Southall. I'm a tenants rights organizer from New Orleans, Louisiana, also known as Babuncha, the Choctaw name for this territory. We've seen the impact of evictions, rent debt, and lack of comprehensive action from our local, state, and federal government. That changes now. A lot of folks joined today's briefing on Zoom, on Facebook, and YouTube. We know thousands more will see this in the future. Because you know that stopping eviction today is truly a matter of life and death. We need you to join people's movement, tenants, and healthcare workers across the country to ensure the health and safety of tens of millions of families at risk of eviction now. You've heard the stories from frontlines, the case for bold, visionary, and decisive action from the Biden administration now, and as Dr. Jones said in her powerful speech, fighting for housing is fighting against oppression. We need action now. Now we need to take action, protect, and defend more than 40 million households at risk of eviction, displacement, and harm in our country. Here's what you can do right now. Sign the petition at homesforall.me/CDC petition to call on the incoming Biden administration, CDC director, to adopt the 3 executive action policy priorities in the Housing Insecure platform on day 1. For organizations, we invite you to join Right to City Alliance, the Grassroots Housing Table, Human Impact Partners, Working Families Party, Alliance for Housing Justice, and many others in signing on to our national sign-on letter to the Biden administration at homesforall.me/CDC sign-on letter _sign-on letter. I'm sure it will pop up on the screen soon. And then 3, for all you joined today who are part of the administration's transition teams, the CDC, public health organizations, housing advocacy organizations, and more, take what you've heard today from tenant leaders and organizers, frontline health workers, legal experts, the public health community. Go back and advocate for the strongest universal eviction moratorium possible at both the federal and state levels. One with teeth, one with power, one that protects the health and safety of millions of renters. No one is protected unless we're all protected. And last but not least, join us on January 7th, 7 days after New Year's Day, y'all, for the Housing Insecure National Day of Action. Text HOMES to 33339 for updates. That's text HOMES, all capitals, to 4319. 33339 for updates. And lastly, I just want to end with something that inspired me. You know, our sister Allison from Atlanta made the really great observation that we don't want a seat at the table. We want the whole banquet hall. And now is our time. Now is our chance. We must do it for our people, the 40 million families are affected. Thank you very much, y'all. God bless you, and y'all have a good day.
Thank you so much for that, Frank. You are absolutely correct. We want it all. No more begging, no more asking. We're taking it. So thank you, Frank, Shakira, Pam, and John. I hope all of you are feeling ready to take action and join the fight to protect families, stop evictions, and build a movement where housing is a human right. We want to make sure while we're building our movement that we also have safe, healthy, and dignified homes for all people. So we want to make sure we get this started and we get it started on the right track. But I'm really encouraged, I'm inspired, and I'm fired up and I'm ready to go. I know about y'all, but y'all better get on this train. I'm fired up and I'm ready to go. I'm fired up. That's right, ready to go. So last but certainly not least, it is my honor to welcome Maurice Mitchell. Maurice Mitchell is a nationally recognized social movement strategist, a visionary leader in the movement for Black Lives, and national director of the Working Families Party. Born and raised in New York to Caribbean working class parents, Maurice began organizing as a teenager and never stopped. As a high school student, Maurice served as a student leader for the Long Island Student Coalition for Peace and Justice. At Howard University, my HBCU, after a classmate was killed by police officers, Maurice led organizing efforts against police brutality and for divestments from private prisons. Maurice went on to work as an organizer for the Long Island Progressive Coalition, downstate organizing director for Citizen Action of New York, and director of New York State Civic Engagement Table. Maurice, we are so excited for you to be joining us today. You are the National Director of the Working Families Party. You have been a major part of organizing to align movement organizations to lead with bold, affirmative, and visionary agendas for our future. But throughout today, we've heard from all of our speakers about the urgent and critical need for the federal government to protect families and keep families in their homes. And we know that this is not only a fight for our people but for people in need. How do you see this fight to stop evictions and utility shutoffs as part of a movement, and what do we need to do as a broader progressive movement in this moment?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Allison. I'm truly honored to be with you, and I am fired up just like you.
Ready to go.
I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm born ready. So if you don't mind, I'd like to respond to your question by taking a little bit of a step back and just contextualizing your question in all of 2020. Now, there's been a lot of ups and downs in 2020, right? We've experienced triumphs and tragedies, and I have to start out by acknowledging that, truly making Donald Trump the first one-term president in nearly 30 years is a major historical accomplishment. And that wasn't a victory so much for President-elect Joe Biden as it was a truly a people's victory. And I really want to center the people who were responsible for bringing us here and truly protecting and defending the little embers of democracy that we have left. Now, the celebrations all over the country looked very similar to those that we see around the world when people topple dictators. Like, we saw people on the ground in spasms of joy and excitement because we did something remarkable. And I just want us to hold that victory. Now, we also have to acknowledge that the incoming Biden-Harris administration is a door, not a destination, right? So beating Trump for many was one step, but we still have our work cut out for us with the incoming administration in Congress. The things we need, creating the conditions where healthcare is a right, Medicare for all, creating the conditions where our economy is a green economy, the Green New Deal, establishing a $15 minimum wage. These are all things that we have to organize and fight for. And we have our work cut out for us over the next 4 to 8 years. And we have to be ready, truly ready to pivot from this victory to the fight ahead of us. And the time when the masses could cast a vote and go home, or cast a vote and go back to brunch, those days never existed, but those days definitely are over now. And we saw what happened when some of us fell asleep at the wheel. In 2008, for example, Barack Obama and Joe Biden rode a blue wave into the White House. And while the Obama administration had some wins, 8 years later, we had Donald Trump in the White House and Republicans in control of a majority of state houses across the country. So progressives spent the last 4 years on defense, winning back seats and putting forth a vision for the country, a positive vision that folks believed in. And I think based on that experience, we're clear that after elections, that just gets us to the position where we could really start cooking with gas. Now, we can't take our foot off the gas anytime soon. The same energy we put into the last 4 years of resistance is the same energy we need to bring to pushing the Biden administration. And we have to challenge the Democrats with the same spirit of resistance that we had for Donald Trump and the GOP. There is really no other option other than keeping that same level of vigor, grassroots intensity and intentionality on the ground. And here's where we get tactical. So we have to fight for bold, transformative executive action. Counting on Congress is one part of the strategy, but we have to push President-elect Biden to do what he can without relying on Congress to do the right thing. So what does executive action that benefits the people really look like? Well, number one, it's about harm mitigation, right? It's a starting point in reversing the deep harm of the outgoing administration and the deep harms that we felt over the past 4 years. But it can't end there. Future executive actions must create the conditions that allow us to not just survive, but to thrive, right? And so we need to do both. We need harm mitigation, especially when so much is on the line for so many people and so many people are suffering. And we need to think ahead and think above of just survival. We also need to push for a government that invests in us instead of large corporations and the wealthy and well-connected. Now, that is a paradigm shift. That is shifting from a government that will see us really move from a model of crisis, we're in crisis and we're responding to crisis, to shifting to a government and an economy that is based on care. Now, before Election Day, the Working Families Party released the People's Charter. The People's Charter is an ambitious, progressive roadmap out of our current crisis that gets us back onto a road to a more just and equitable society that works for the many, not the few. The People's Charter represents an aspirational but concrete agenda around which progressives can rally for COVID relief, for jobs and healthcare for all, for bold, transformative police reform, where we're disinvesting from the things that hurt us and investing into true safety, and bold action on climate. The Charter focuses on 5 things. Number 1, care for the wronged, repairing historic harms and ending systemic racism. Number 2, emergency care, helping everyone get and stay well, supporting workers and families, and also supporting small businesses as long as it takes. Number 3, a good job for everyone who needs one. Working people can't wait years for jobs to come back. We need millions of jobs now. Number 4, caring for each other, addressing the deficiencies in how our government cares for us and dealing with the pandemic head on. And lastly, caring for our future, acting now to make us all more resilient to the challenges that we know we will confront. We're experiencing a crisis right now. We're experiencing a global pandemic. This crisis will end. We will eventually win the war against this pandemic. However, there will be future crises, and so we have to care for our future to build that resiliency. So this is also why we're embracing Right to the City's platform. See, the impact of the global pandemic on the economy for working people has only increased the need to fight for robust housing protections that keep everyone safe, sustainable, and in affordable housing. Now, we cannot ask people to stay home, as we're asking with all of these global shutdowns, if people have no home to stay in. And as difficult as this final piece might be, we also need to practice having some empathy and compassion for the working people who are on the other side of this issue. Now, there are people who are protesting the lockdowns, and those folks are living under the same conditions that all of us are, living under the same conditions that caused us to organize mutual aid in our neighborhoods. And the blame isn't in our neighbors, even as much as we disagree with their politics. Ultimately, the blame is on organized capital. Ultimately, the blame is on a government that chose not to care for us, that chose to be out for lunch and abrogate the responsibilities, their most basic responsibilities, in order to show up when we needed them to show up. People have been forced to choose between risking their health or going to work, or risking their jobs or staying at home. And these are untenable, no-win solutions for working people. The government has not shown up for working people in general, whether they identify with the left or the right. It's our job now to shift the conditions on the ground before this schism and the contradictions between working people grows and is further exploited by organized capital, by far-right populists, by elected officials and others who don't care about working people at all and are interested in using those cleavages in order to maintain control. That is why our organizing is so essential. That is why these bold principles and these platforms are essential day one. and why it's so critical that we don't put our foot off the gas, but we actually rev up when it comes to our organizing, our challenging, our pushing, our resistance, in order to create the conditions so that the Biden administration could govern in the bold way that this electoral mandate has suggested that they should govern. So that means, in closing, that all of us need to organize like never before at a time when so much is on the line. Thank you. Allison, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Maurice. We really appreciate those inspirational words. We do look forward to working together in the near future. I just want to really reiterate some of the things that you were saying in closing. Now is not the time to retreat. Now is our time to cash in. We have been given enough insufficient checks. No more insufficient funds. It is our time to be transformative and not transactional. We are so happy that each of you could join us today. And we want you to make sure you're doing just as Maurice asked. Keep your feet on the gas. 4 years is not enough time. We must be proactive in organizing. We must lift up our voices. We must lead by example. This is the time to go forward and lead from the front, lead from the side. And if you can't, we understand, but we need you with us. We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be engaged. But we importantly want you and everyone else to know that housing is a human right. We thank you for being here and sharing this time with us today. We want to give a special shout out and thank you for everyone who was able to attend, and to some of our co-sponsors, Human Impact Partners, Working Families Party, Grassroots Housing Table, Partnership for Working Families, People's Action, Center for Popular Democracy, New York Housing Justice Alliance, MH Action, Alliance for Housing, Lawyers Committee, Housing Justice League, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, New York Doctors Coalition, Policy Link, National Nurses United, Lawyers Committees for Civil Rights Under Law, Alliance for Housing Justice, and It Takes Roots, and of course, Rights to the City. I also want to acknowledge and lift up Nicolas Salvatore, who was having some technical difficulties and was not able to share his amazing story. But it is one to be heard and it's one to be listened to. It will be recorded and it will be sent to each of you who are interested in hearing it. We want to apologize that he was not able to speak. Again, we thank you for joining us, and please have a wonderful day.